The moment my daughter stood in front of the church full of people, stopped the wedding and pointed straight at me, something inside my chest cracked open in a way I didn't even know was possible. And even now when I close my eyes I can still hear the silence that followed, heavy like a storm that had been waiting years just to fall on my head. It's strange how life works, how moments you never prepared for somehow find you, drag you by the throat, and force you to confront truths you've buried so deep you almost convinced yourself they were gone. But nothing ever really disappears, not pain, not memory, not the things we flee from. They sit quietly inside us like sleeping animals waiting to wake. And mine woke the day my daughter raised her hand, her voice shaking, and demanded that everyone stop. Even before she opened her mouth, I knew something was coming for me. I felt it in the heat crawling up my spine, in the strange stillness inside my chest, in that cold fear that whispers your name like an old enemy returning home. And in that moment I realized this wasn't just about her stopping a wedding. It was about everything that had been silently growing between us for years. I remember the 0 to 3 second hook of my own life bursting open the moment she locked eyes with me. She was standing there in a soft blue dress that didn't match the colors chosen for the ceremony, but she wore it anyway because she always refused to bend herself into anything she didn't believe in, something she inherited from me even though she likes to pretend she didn't. She wasn't the bride, but she might as well have been because all eyes fell on her the way you look at a person who holds a secret that could ruin or save you. And the worst part was, I didn't even know which one it would be. The 3 to 15 second setup of that moment was the way her lips trembled, not with fear, but with fury that had been fermenting quietly inside her for so long that I wondered how I never noticed. I thought we were healing. I thought time had stitched things together. I thought love would be enough. But life has a way of reminding you that what you ignore doesn't disappear. It grows claws. And she was standing there, her chest rising and falling like she was about to start a war she'd rehearsed for months, maybe even years. The air in the church became thick, almost suffocating, like everyone could feel we were on the edge of something irreversible. Maybe we were. By the time we crossed the 15 to 60 second mark of tension, everything inside me began to unravel. Weddings are supposed to be moments of joy, of union, of family coming together like pieces of a puzzle that finally fit. But instead, I felt like my own daughter was about to pull the puzzle apart piece by piece until nothing remained but the truth we had both run from. And maybe that's what made it worse. I knew she had something to say. I just didn't know whether the target was me or the man standing at the altar waiting for his bride, or the groom's mother who never liked me, or maybe the entire room who had spent years building stories about me they whispered when they thought I couldn't hear. I don't know what scared me more, that she was about to expose a secret I thought was dead, or that I genuinely didn't know which one she would choose. And somewhere in the mess of it all, the memories came back like a river breaking through a weak dam. The years I spent surviving a marriage that almost broke my bones, the nights I hid tears under blankets so my daughter wouldn't see, the day I packed our bags and ran because living had become harder than leaving, the look in her eyes when she said she hated me for taking her away from her father, not realizing I was trying to save her from a home that was killing us both. It's strange how children don't understand your sacrifices until they're old enough to recognize your wounds. And even then, sometimes they still refuse to see. As the 60 to 90 second turning point of the moment approached, her voice finally rose. And it wasn't soft or scared or confused. It was steady, bold, and frightening in that way only truth can be when it's been suffocating for too long and finally finds air. She looked at me like she wanted answers that I'd been too afraid to give. Like she wanted to dig into a past I had buried because it hurt too much to remember. I didn't know what she was about to say, but I knew it would change everything. And I could feel the stares from everyone in the room. Old aunties waiting for gist, uncles pretending to be concerned, church members silently judging, and the bride clutching her bouquet like her entire wedding depended on the next words my daughter would speak. Maybe it did. And just when I thought my heart couldn't beat any louder, she inhaled deeply, pointed at me like I was the center of a crime scene, and prepared to break open a truth that none of us were ready for. Her chest rose. Her mouth parted. Her eyes locked onto mine with a mixture of anger, hurt, and something that looked almost like betrayal. I felt the floor tilt under me as she prepared to speak, and all I could think was, God, not now. Not here. Not like this. But life doesn't wait for perfect timing. It strikes when your guard is low, when your heart is tired, when your past thinks you've healed enough to face it. And my past had chosen that exact moment, surrounded by flowers, music, and people who didn't know half the truth, to come knocking on my chest. Hard. And before she even said the first word, I knew our lives were about to split into two, before this moment and after. The moment her voice finally filled the church, everything inside me froze as if my bones suddenly remembered every year of pain I'd tried to bury, and all the air I thought I had left collapsed inside my chest like a dying flame, because the first words she spoke didn't sound like a child confronting her mother. They sounded like a young woman standing on the ruins of everything she had survived and everything she still resented me for, and in that instant I realized I had been living with a fantasy, telling myself that time had softened her anger, that motherhood had humbled her, that adulthood had made her see me with kinder eyes. But I was wrong, painfully wrong, and the truth stood there wearing a soft blue dress and shaking with emotions she had carried for far too long. The 0 to 3 second shock of her opening was enough to make the entire congregation go silent in a way that felt unnatural, like the world paused just to listen to her. And even though she didn't call my name, everyone knew she was speaking to me because her eyes were locked onto mine with a fire that could burn through stone. She said she couldn't let the wedding continue, not like this, not while the truth was still buried, not while lies were still dancing in the room, and hearing her voice tremble under the weight of those words felt like someone had shoved a blade between my ribs and twisted it slowly, not to kill me, but to make me feel the depth of everything she had been carrying alone. And as those words settled over the room, the 3 to 15 second setup unfolded in a slow, painful wave, because that was when she told everyone that families pretend too much, that smiles can be masks, that celebrations can be built on top of secrets so deep they rot the foundation. And when she said that, I saw a few heads in the audience drop, eyes darting away, people swallowing hard, as if her truth had found shadows in their own lives too. Weddings bring out the best and worst in people, and in that moment, it felt like everyone was being forced to look at their own reflection through her anger. As she spoke, the 15 to 60 second rising tension twisted around all of us like a storm cloud that refused to move. And she said she couldn't let her cousin marry a man when the whole family was pretending nothing was wrong, when everyone was ignoring the real reason she hated weddings, when people whispered about her behind her back without ever asking why she never speaks to her father. And before I could even swallow the pain building in my throat, she said the one sentence I feared: that no one should be allowed to build a new future while the past is still bleeding. Those words punched through me because I knew where she was going. I knew the path she was dragging me down. I had prayed we would never revisit that version of ourselves. The broken home, the nights she clung to me crying for a father who refused to love her, the bruises I hid under scarves, the lies I told her to protect her innocence, the years she blamed me for saving her, because she thought I destroyed her family instead of rescuing her from a nightmare she was too young to recognize. And when she said people keep telling women to be strong, to endure, to move on, but never allow them space to breathe, heal, or speak, I felt something inside me crumble, because those were the same words I used to repeat into the mirror to convince myself to survive one more day. Her voice cracked as she continued, and the 60 to 90 second turning point hit when she finally confessed to the entire church that the reason she hated this wedding wasn't about the bride or the groom, but because watching families celebrate felt like rubbing salt into wounds she never healed. She said she grew up feeling abandoned not just by her father but by me too, because even though I did everything to protect her, she never understood the reasons behind my decisions. She said she had questions that aged inside her heart like old wine, turning bitter with time, questions she never asked me because she was afraid of the answers, questions she thought I'd never give willingly. And then she said the part that broke me the most, that she was tired of pretending we were fine, tired of forcing smiles, tired of acting like the past didn't haunt every step of her life. The entire room sat still. Even the bride forgot to breathe. I could feel my heartbeat echoing in my ears like a drum, slow and heavy, drowning out every sound except my daughter's trembling voice. But then the Betrayal bomb dropped, the one that sucked all the oxygen out of the building. She said there were things the family didn't know about me, things she discovered recently, things that changed the way she saw me, and when she said she wasn't sure if she could forgive me, my entire body felt like it was sinking into the floor. I didn't know what she had found. I didn't know how deep she had dug. I didn't know if she had spoken to my ex-husband, or if someone in the family had whispered something poisonous into her ear. All I knew in that moment was that whatever came next would rewrite everything between us. As she stood there trembling, eyes blazing with old wounds, her fingers twitching at her side like she was holding onto something she didn't know how to release, she said the one thing that forced everyone in the room to lean forward: that the truth she was about to reveal would change everything they thought they knew about our family, about me, about the past I had spent years burying. Then she looked at me again, and her gaze was no longer angry but wounded, desperate, almost pleading for me to prepare myself for what she had uncovered. And just when she inhaled, ready to speak the truth that would break the past wide open, the doors at the back of the church swung open. My heart stopped. Someone walked in. Someone none of us expected. Someone whose voice, presence, and shadow had defined our lives in ways no one in that room truly understood. Someone she had no right to bring into this moment. Someone I wasn't ready to face again. Someone who should have stayed gone forever. The moment the church doors swung open and I saw the silhouette step inside, every muscle in my body tightened the way a child grips a sheet during a nightmare, because the shock of that moment didn't feel like ordinary fear. It felt like the kind of terror that lives in your bones, the kind that remembers things your mind tries to forget, the kind that crawls out of buried history with a face you prayed you'd never see again. And as that figure walked forward, the entire room inhaled at the same time, like we were all being pulled into a single breath of disbelief that tasted like old wounds resurrecting themselves in the middle of a wedding. The 0 to 3 second hook of that moment was brutal because the instant the light fell on his face I felt my knees weaken beneath me, not out of love or nostalgia, but out of the raw shock of seeing the man I swore I would never stand in the same room with again, the man whose presence made my daughter's voice tremble, the man whose decisions shaped the woman I became, sometimes through pain, sometimes through survival, and sometimes through fear. My ex-husband stood there like a ghost wearing human skin, older, thinner, with shadows under his eyes that told stories I didn't ask for, but it was the way he looked directly at me, ignoring the bride, the groom, the pastor, everyone, that made something cold and heavy sink deep inside my stomach. The 3 to 15 second setup stretched unbearably as my daughter's face went pale, then red, then something in between, as if she couldn't decide whether to scream, run, or collapse, because she hadn't seen him in years, not since the day I pulled her away from that house and locked the door on a chapter one hoped would never reopen. And now here he was, walking down the aisle like a man who believed he still belonged in our lives, like he had been summoned by her words, like the truth she wanted to reveal had dragged him from whatever dark place he'd disappeared into. My chest tightened as he approached because with each step he took, I remembered every bruise I hid, every apology he never gave, every time I begged God to make him the man he promised he would be, every night my daughter cried into my clothes because she didn't understand why her father loved his demons more than his family, and seeing him again felt like someone ripping open a wound that had sealed itself through years of silence. The 15 to 60 second rising tension unfolded as the congregation whispered among themselves, confused and anxious, because no one expected him, not here, not today, not after so long, and the bride clutched her groom's arm like she didn't know whether this was still a wedding or the beginning of a family scandal that would echo through the community for months. My ex-husband stopped halfway down the aisle, staring at my daughter with a mixture of guilt and longing, but she stared back at him with a rage that looked too old for her age, a rage she had carried since childhood, a rage she never fully expressed because she feared the truth would shatter whatever fragile image she tried to keep of him. And then my heart cracked when I realized something. She knew he was coming. The way her eyes flicked from him to me wasn't shock. It was confirmation, like she had been waiting for this moment, like she had orchestrated something, like this confrontation was not an accident but a calculated explosion she had been building toward for months. The weight of that realization made my palms sweat because it meant she didn't trust me enough to warn me. It meant she believed the truth needed him present. It meant she thought I would lie if she asked me directly. And that broke me more than his return. The 60 to 90 second turning point slammed into me when my daughter finally spoke again, her voice sharp and steady, dripping with pain, and she said that she couldn't stay silent anymore because lies had lived in our family long enough, because she was tired of pretending she didn't know what happened, because she finally understood the truth that had been stolen from her childhood, and when she said she found something hidden, something that explained everything, I felt my legs buckle. Slightly. What had she found? A letter? A recording? An old message? A memory someone whispered to her? My mind raced through every possibility, every secret I thought I buried, everything I never told her about the nights her father came home drunk, about the day I nearly lost my life trying to protect her, about the truth behind why I ran, about the truth behind who truly broke our family. And as my thoughts spiraled, she lifted her chin and said she discovered why we left, why I never went back, why he vanished, and why he suddenly returned now. The shock in my ex-husband's eyes confirmed it. She found something he never expected her to see. Then something terrifying happened. My daughter reached into her purse and pulled out a small folded envelope, old, stained, and familiar in a way that made my breath catch. I knew it instantly. I recognized the handwriting even from afar. My ex-husband's handwriting. A letter I never meant for her to read. A letter I kept hidden for years because revealing it would destroy whatever was left of her innocence. How did she find it? When did she find it? Why no. The envelope shook slightly in her hand as she said she read every word, every confession, every truth, every detail that changed the way she saw both of us. And before I could beg her not to, she said that the letter revealed who the real villain was in our family, and it wasn't the person she spent years blaming. Gasps erupted around the room. My vision blurred at the edges. My ex-husband's face drained of color as if the blood abandoned him all at once. And just as the tension began to suffocate everyone, my daughter walked toward me slowly, her heels clicking like the countdown of a bomb, and she held out the letter. Not toward me but toward the entire room, as if she wanted the world to witness the truth I spent my life trying to bury. Then she looked into my eyes with a sadness so deep it almost broke me in half, and she whispered without speaking, her lips forming a question I wasn't ready to answer. "Why didn't you tell me?" Before she could unfold the letter, before I could reach for her hand, before the truth could be unleashed in front of an entire church, something happened that no one expected. My ex-husband moved. Fast. He reached her in 2 strides and grabbed her wrist, not harshly but desperately, pleading with her through his eyes not to read that letter aloud. But my daughter snatched her hand back, fire blazing in her expression, and said something so soft only the front row could hear, but the weight of it spread like wildfire. That she knew everything now, that he wasn't the man she thought he was, and if he didn't want the truth revealed, she would make sure everyone heard it. The room tensed. The bride stepped back. The pastor's mouth hung open. My chest ached so deeply it felt like I was being split in two. And then my daughter did the unthinkable. She opened the letter, raised it, began to read. But before she could finish the first sentence, someone else stood up in the back of the church. A woman. Someone I recognized. Someone I never expected to see. Someone who had more power over this story than either me or my ex-husband. And she said one sentence that stopped my daughter cold. A sentence that froze the entire room. A sentence that revealed a secret even I didn't know. The moment the woman stood up at the back of the church and spoke, everything inside me collapsed into a cold, sinking heaviness, because the voice that echoed across the room didn't belong to a stranger. It belonged to someone I had spent years trying to erase from my memory. Someone whose presence meant that the past was no longer a ghost haunting us quietly but a living, breathing thing stepping forward to expose every crack we tried to seal. And the shock of hearing her voice pulled all the strength out of my knees. The 0 to 3 second hook hit brutally hard as she walked forward with the slow confidence of someone who had been waiting for this moment. Someone who didn't fear consequences. Someone who believed she had the right to speak. My daughter's hand froze midair, the letter still open, her eyes widening as recognition flooded her face, while my ex-husband went completely still, his jaw tightening, his shoulders sinking, the look of a man cornered by a truth he hoped would never return. And as the woman approached the front of the church, the 3 to 15 second setup unfolded in a chilling hush, because every step she took cracked open memories I had buried in a grave so deep I thought I would never have to face them again. Memories of betrayal that didn't come from fists or insults, but from something far more insidious, something that rewired the way I saw myself as a woman, a wife, and a mother. She was the woman who had destroyed my home long before I ever fled, the woman who played friend during the day and slipped into my marriage at night, the woman whose shadow lingered in every argument, every cold silence, every tear my daughter wiped from my face as a child. She was the hidden war, the silent wound, the reason my husband became someone I didn't recognize anymore, and seeing her walk into this holy moment felt like someone dragging the devil into church without invitation. As she reached the aisle, the 15 to 60 second rising tension gripped everyone like a tightening fist when she said she had kept quiet for too long, that lies had poisoned enough of our lives, that she wasn't going to let my daughter blame the wrong person, and the way she said it, calm, measured, almost rehearsed, made something deep in me snap because it meant she hadn't come here by accident. This wasn't coincidence. This was planned. Or coordinated. Or worse, invited. I looked at my daughter and saw conflict twisting across her face, a mixture of confusion, hurt, and recognition, and I knew in that moment my worst fear was true. My daughter had spoken to someone she shouldn't have, searching for pieces of the truth I refused to give her, And she had found this woman instead. A woman who would never tell the truth without twisting it into a shape that benefited her. My chest burned with panic as the woman stopped beside my daughter and placed a hand on her shoulder gently, like she had the right to touch her, like she had earned a place in her world, and my daughter didn't pull away. That alone felt like a knife. The 60 to 90-second turning point hit like thunder when the woman announced to the entire church that my daughter wasn't wrong for wanting answers, that she deserved the truth, but that the letter she was holding didn't tell the whole story, that it only revealed one side of the pain, and that if she read it without context she would destroy the wrong person. The room exhaled a collective gasp as whispers rippled through the congregation like a wave of fire, and my own breath stuttered in my chest because I knew exactly what she was doing. She was shifting the narrative. She was planting seeds. She was preparing to rewrite history in real time, and my daughter, my child who had been starving for truth, was ready to devour anything that resembled it. My ex-husband stepped forward, reaching for the woman as if to stop her, but she turned slightly, shaking her head with a small, mournful smile, the kind of smile that makes strangers believe you're the victim even when you're the architect of the disaster. And then she said something that made every nerve in my body tremble. She claimed that she knew why I left, but more importantly, she claimed she knew the real reason my ex-husband disappeared. My daughter's eyes snapped toward her, sharp, searching, desperate. The bride held onto her groom like the floor had turned to water. Even the pastor lowered his Bible. And then, with a voice too calm for the weight of what she was saying, the woman revealed that my ex-husband had not left voluntarily, that he hadn't abandoned the family the way everyone believed, that he was forced out, by someone none of us expected. Her words sliced the church open. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear anything else. But then she turned and looked at me, directly, coldly, knowingly, and said something that almost sent me to my knees. She claimed that I wasn't the only one who ran. He said I drove him out. He said I hid things too. She said I wasn't innocent. And the way she framed it, smooth, calculated, dripping with poisonous grace, made it sound like truth. It made people's eyes shift toward me. It made whispers rise again. It made my daughter's hand shake around the letter as she stared at me, searching for confirmation or denial, but I could tell she already believed parts of the woman's story. My ex-husband's face twisted in pain as he said her name under his breath, pleading with her not to continue, but she ignored him completely and took the letter from my daughter's hand, holding it up for everyone to see. The paper trembled slightly in her fingers, but her voice did not. She said the letter wasn't a confession of guilt. It was a confession of fear. She said he wrote it the night everything fell apart, the night I left. She said he wasn't trying to justify his actions. He was trying to protect someone. And when she said that, she turned her head slowly, eyes landing on my daughter with a stare so heavy it felt like the world tilted. She said he didn't disappear because he didn't love his family. He disappeared because staying would have destroyed us all. My daughter gasped. The audience stirred. My hands went cold. Then the woman said the words that shattered the room, that the reason my ex-husband vanished was tied to someone else in the family. Someone powerful, someone controlling, someone who had been manipulating all of us quietly, someone who didn't want the truth revealed. Someone she claimed would do anything to keep their secret buried. And then she looked directly at the bride's mother, a woman who had sat quietly through the entire drama with a strange stiffness in her posture. And the bride's mother went completely still. My daughter turned toward her aunt slowly, eyes narrowing, and whispered a name so soft it felt like a ghost drifting across the church. My ex-husband stepped forward again as if trying to shield someone from what was coming. The bride's mother clutched her pearls with trembling fingers. The entire church shifted, breaths held in collective anticipation. And then the woman, with a voice sharpened by years of hidden bitterness and twisted truth, said that the family's darkest secret wasn't about violence, betrayal, or abandonment. It was about lineage, about blood, about who my daughter truly belonged to. And before anyone could swallow the shock, she dropped the bomb that split my world apart. My daughter's father might not be the man we thought he was. I knew something inside me had shattered the moment I heard my daughter call my name at the front of that church. But what I didn't realize until later was that it wasn't just shock she unleashed. It was a truth I had been running from for years. I stood there frozen as everyone turned toward her. Yet instead of anger, the one thing rising inside me was the growing ache of a woman who had carried too much in silence and was now being forced into the light. In those few seconds after her outburst, while the groom's mother gasped and the officiating minister slowly lowered his Bible, All I could think about was the little girl who once held my hand so tightly after nightmares, and how that same little girl was now grown enough to expose a wound I had buried deep, and the weight of that realization pressed on my chest like a stone I had refused to admit existed. The setup of the moment didn't come from the words she said but from the way she looked at me. A mixture of fear, betrayal, and a desperate plea for me to stop pretending that everything was fine, because the truth was bubbling beneath the surface and threatening to drown us both. And as the tension rose inside the room, I could feel the stares digging into my skin, people whispering, some assuming madness, others sensing scandal, while I quietly battled the rising tide of memories I had prayed would never return, especially not today. My daughter stepped closer, her shoulders tense, her eyes glistening like she had been holding this pain for far longer than I ever realized, and with every step she took, the reality of my past, the one I thought I had left behind, started to uncoil itself inside me like a serpent waking from deep sleep. The turning point came when she reached me and said in a trembling voice she tried to hide behind composure that she couldn't let the wedding continue because I had lied to her for too long. And those words struck me so deeply that I felt the air escape my lungs. Because even though she thought she was revealing something, she didn't know the whole truth, the real truth, the one that would change everything if spoken aloud. In that instant, as everyone waited for my reaction, the groom shifting uncomfortably, the guests leaning in, my daughter breathing fast as if she had crossed a point of no return, I realized I had two choices: protect the fragile peace I had built or finally confess what I had been hiding for almost 2 decades. And yet before I could decide, before I could gather my thoughts long enough to even form a response, something unexpected happened that made the church fall into a deeper kind of silence, the kind that tightens a room and makes hearts pound. The back door of the church opened slowly, letting in a cold draft that swept across the aisle, and the sight of who stepped in made my daughter's face drain of color instantly. I felt my knees weaken because the man standing there wasn't supposed to be alive, wasn't supposed to be anywhere near us, wasn't supposed to return. And as he lifted his head and our eyes met for the first time in years, I knew the story my daughter thought she understood was about to twist into something none of us were prepared for. The moment I saw him standing at the back of the church, a cold shock ripped through my chest so sharply that I felt my entire body stiffen as if time itself had grabbed me by the throat. Because the man I had spent years trying to forget, the man whose absence defined every chapter of my life, had walked into the room at the exact moment my daughter was tearing open old wounds I had never learned how to close. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. I didn't even move. I just stared at him, feeling the weight of a past I had buried under silence and survival claw its way back to the surface. It wasn't just that he was here. It was how he looked at me. Not with regret. Not with hesitation. But with a familiarity that made my stomach twist and a quiet claim that reminded me why I had run in the first place. The church fell into a heavy silence, one that pressed against my ears until the sound of my own heartbeat felt painfully loud. And yet the only person I could focus on was my daughter, whose fingers were shaking against my arm, her breathing shallow and confused as she tried to understand why the room had shifted, why my entire body had gone unnaturally still, why the man at the door felt like a shadow that belonged to a life she never knew existed. The setup of the moment formed itself slowly as he took his first step down the aisle, each footfall echoing like a memory I never wanted to revisit, because everything about his presence felt wrong, intrusive, calculated, almost as if he had been waiting for this exact day to reappear and remind me of the person I fought so hard not to become again. The tension built inside me the way a storm gathers over dark water, creeping, rising, tightening around my ribs as flashes of the past began to seep through the cracks I had tightly sealed. I remembered the night I ran, the night I wrapped my baby in a blanket and told myself that even if I had nothing, even if the world saw me as broken or foolish or weak, I would still choose safety over suffering. I remembered the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears as I slipped out the door and into the cold, praying that fate would forgive me for leaving behind a man who thought control was the same as love. And now, standing in that church, surrounded by people who had no idea the kind of life I had once escaped, I felt that version of myself clawing up from the depths of my memory, the frightened woman who had learned how to survive by disappearing, by staying silent, by pretending everything was fine even when nothing was. My daughter glanced between us, her eyes swelling with confusion and something deeper, something like instinctive dread, and the more she stared at him, the more I could feel her spirit shrinking beside me, as if her own body knew before her mind did that something about him was dangerous. I could feel the tension rise with every step he took closer to us. Even the guests sensed it. Conversations died mid-whisper. Chairs creaked softly as people leaned forward. The groom's mother clutched her purse tighter. The minister lowered his gaze like he had suddenly stepped into a story he wanted no part of. And still he walked closer, his shoulders squared, his eyes never leaving my face, and I felt memories I had fought to forget swirl around me like cold mist, memories of raised voices, locked doors, promises that tasted like threats, apologies that never came, and a version of love that felt more like possession than partnership. When he finally reached us, the turning point hit me so hard I nearly lost my balance, because the look he gave my daughter wasn't curiosity or confusion. It was recognition, painful and undeniable recognition. And the moment she noticed it too, her breath hitched, her eyes widening as fear flickered across her face like a flame catching onto dry cloth. Something inside me cracked open. A sharp, trembling ache spread across my chest as I realized the truth I had worked years to bury was rising to the surface, threatening to break everything I had built for her, everything I had sacrificed, everything I had endured. He looked at her with a calmness that unsettled me, the kind of calmness that belongs to someone who believes they still have a right to the life they abandoned. And as his gaze flickered back to mine, I felt a pull in my stomach that made me want to scream, to run, to shield her with my entire body. My daughter stepped closer to me, her voice barely above a whisper as she asked why I never told her, why I hid something so important. And the guilt swallowed me whole because the truth was complicated, messy, painful in ways that words couldn't hold. I had stayed silent for her, for us, for the fragile peace I was trying to protect. And yet that silence was now tearing everything apart. The church felt smaller, suffocating, the walls closing in around us as he stepped a little closer. And I realized that the moment I had been running from for years had finally come. He opened his mouth and said something that made the entire room freeze. But it wasn't the words alone. It was the way my daughter reacted. Her eyes filled with disbelief, her lips trembling as she looked at me as though I had stabbed her, as though everything she had ever known about her life had shifted under her feet. People around us gasped, the groom stepped back, and I felt my insides collapse like a shattered dam because the truth I had never wanted her to discover had now been ripped open in front of a room full of strangers. But before I could speak, before I could explain, before I could tell her the real story, the truth behind my silence, something inside her broke. Something so deep that I saw it in the way she stepped back from me, the way her hands shook, the way she refused to blink as tears pooled in her eyes. And as she stared at me like a stranger, like a woman she didn't recognize, I felt the world I had built crumble in slow motion, pieces falling away until nothing was left but the one terrifying question I had prayed she would never ask. And when she finally opened her mouth and whispered it, barely breathing, trembling from a truth she was not prepared for, I knew that the next words I spoke would change both of our lives forever. The church felt impossibly heavy as the air around us thickened with every heartbeat, and I realized in a terrifying way that no one present could understand the storm that had quietly settled over me, the one that had been brewing since the day I first cradled my daughter and promised her safety while hiding the truth I never thought I could say, because even now, watching her tremble in confusion and fear, I knew that everything I had built to protect her was unraveling before my eyes. And nothing could stop it. The moment stretched and lengthened, each second drawn out by the unbearable weight of what was coming, because he, the man who had vanished for years and returned as if time had never touched him, had stepped so close to us that I could see the faint lines of weariness around his eyes, the shadows that told stories of nights spent away from home, the quiet exhaustion of someone carrying secrets too heavy for a single lifetime, and yet the intensity of his gaze cut through the room as if he had every right to demand attention, every right to reclaim the past that had been stolen, and every right to disrupt the fragile peace I had been clinging to for so long. The setup of the moment unfolded slowly, painfully, as my daughter's fingers gripped my arm so tightly that I could feel the tremors of her uncertainty, the unspoken questions she didn't yet know how to voice, the confusion that comes when the world you thought was safe suddenly tilts on an axis you never imagined existed. And I realized in that moment that no amount of explanation, no carefully rehearsed lie, no shield of silence could prepare her for what she was about to learn, because the truth I had hidden had dimensions even I had barely dared to acknowledge, and now they were spilling into the room like a flood with no way to dam it. Tension mounted around us as the congregation held its collective breath, the groom frozen in hesitation, the bride gripping his arm as if the floor itself might swallow them, and even the pastor seemed unsure how to proceed, his eyes flicking between us as if sensing the enormity of the confrontation that was unfolding in what should have been a sanctuary of celebration. My mind raced with fragments of the past, nights of whispered fears, the long silences of absence, the small lies I had told to protect her, the choices I had made in desperation, and suddenly every memory felt like a weapon pointed at my chest, ready to dismantle the image of strength and safety I had tried to maintain for her. The rising tension of the moment, 15 to 60 seconds, enveloped me, pressing against my ribs and demanding attention, forcing me to reckon with the realization that the past I had carefully tucked away was no longer a secret, that the threads I had hoped to keep hidden were now tangled in plain view, visible to anyone who chose to look closely enough. My daughter's gaze flitted between me and him, sharp, searching, accusatory, and vulnerable all at once, and I felt a pang of fear unlike anything I had experienced in years, because I understood the power of her discovery, the way she had pieced together fragments of truth that I had thought were invisible, the way she was beginning to see the skeletons in our family closet in their full, haunting form, and the way that realization was reshaping her perception of both of us in real time. The turning point of this unbearable confrontation came subtly at first, in the micro-expressions, the barely perceptible shifts in stance, the way he finally lowered his head for a fleeting moment, perhaps a silent acknowledgement of the chaos he had caused, the pain he had left behind, the weight of responsibility that he had evaded for so long, and yet that moment alone was enough to destabilize the entire room, to make the air feel like it was charged with static, as though even the walls themselves held their breath in anticipation of what would follow. My body felt every emotion simultaneously: guilt, dread, fear, sorrow, longing, exhaustion. A tangled knot of sensation that left me dizzy and hollow, a witness to the unspooling of a story that I had believed I could control, a narrative I had hoped to shape for my daughter, and now the threads were slipping through my fingers, unraveling at the hands of history, revelation, and her own growing awareness. The room seemed to expand and contract at once, time slowing as every eye in the church turned toward the trio at the front, watching with a mixture of horror, fascination, and disbelief, and I felt the full weight of the strategic viral moment pressing down. The hook, the setup, the rising tension, the turning point, each beat hitting with precision in the silent theater of our lives, a drama that no one could step away from. And then, as he took another step forward, inching closer to both of us, his presence reasserting the gravity of the past, I realized that the hardest part was not the revelations themselves but the way they were reshaping my daughter's world. The way the daughter I had tried to protect for 2 decades was now standing on the precipice of a truth that would forever change her understanding of love, loyalty, and family. Her hands shook, her lips quivered, her wide eyes reflected a storm of emotions I could barely name, and my own chest tightened as I silently begged for her to understand that nothing about the life I had built, nothing about the choices I had made, nothing about the sacrifices I had endured were meant to harm her, even as the evidence of hurt stacked itself like bricks around her small frame. Every movement he made, every subtle tilt of his head, every pause in his breath was a reminder of the absence that had shaped us, the silences that had defined our relationship, and the shadows that had crept into our lives when he left. And suddenly I felt the entire weight of our collective past pressing on me so intensely that I wondered if I could breathe, if I could speak, if I could survive the truth being revealed in this charged room. The rising tension spiraled toward the final beat when my daughter finally stepped back, clutching the letter as though it were a lifeline, her eyes darting between us, between the man who had abandoned her and me, the mother who had tried to shield her from the past, and the room held its breath, every guest sensing the impending collapse of our fragile lives. And as I reached toward her, my hand trembling, heart pounding, I knew that the next second, the next word spoken, the next movement, would determine whether she would see me as protector or betrayer, whether he would reclaim the narrative of his absence, and whether the truth could ever coexist with the love we had tried to maintain. The church felt suspended in the weight of all these unspoken words, all these invisible histories, all the pain, the anger, the longing, and in that infinite moment of suspended reality, I realized with a cold certainty that nothing would ever be the same again, that the story we had lived for decades was breaking apart in real time, and that the one step forward, the one word, the one choice made now could either destroy us completely or begin the slow, agonizing path toward understanding and reconciliation, a path I had prayed for in private for years but never expected to face in front of an audience that had no idea what they were witnessing. And just as my daughter's lips parted to speak, just as the letter trembled in her hand, Just as he leaned slightly forward as if to claim a fragment of the truth for himself, the doors of the church opened once more, and a figure I had never expected stepped through the frame, bringing with them a presence that promised to shift the balance yet again, introducing a new force into a story already saturated with betrayal, pain, and revelation, a force whose arrival ensured that the next moment would be impossible to predict, impossible to control, and impossible to ignore. The moment the newcomer finally spoke, the room seemed to shrink around me, the walls pressing in as though the church itself understood that secrets long buried were about to claw their way into the open, and I felt the weight of every past choice, every hidden truth, every silent prayer I had whispered in darkness crash over me in a tidal wave that left me shaking and hollow at once, because I understood that this confrontation was no longer about ceremony or appearances. It was about survival, about legacy, about the fragile line between love and betrayal, and about how much a child could bear when the world she trusted suddenly turned into a landscape of deception and revelation. The air was heavy, thick with anticipation, every breath feeling like it carried the electricity of an impending storm, and my daughter stood frozen beside me, her wide eyes fixed on the newcomer as if she were trying to read intentions that were deliberately cloaked in years of silence, as though she hoped that by sheer will she could make sense of a past I had hoped would never surface in front of anyone, let alone in a place where so many witnesses could see the fracture lines of our family beginning to widen. My chest tightened painfully as I recalled all the times I had held her close, shielding her from truths that were never mine to reveal, and now, standing in a church filled with eyes that measured us both, I felt the crushing irony that every protective action I had taken had led to this very moment where everything I had tried to hide was being illuminated in stark, unforgiving light. The setup unfolded slowly, relentlessly, because every movement of the newcomer, every subtle shift of expression, every pause that seemed to stretch into eternity, reminded me that nothing about this encounter was accidental, that every second had been carefully orchestrated in the quiet corridors of memory, in the whispered plans and unspoken calculations of those who had known the power of timing and the fragility of human trust. And I realized with a cold clarity that we were all about to witness a story that had been waiting decades to emerge. The rising tension built in layers, a slow-burning fire of realization and fear that clawed at my insides, because my daughter's gaze had shifted between us in a pattern I could not predict, and with every glance I understood that she was beginning to connect fragments I had hoped she would never see, that she was starting to perceive the subtleties of manipulation, absence, and betrayal that had shaped our lives, and that her young mind, though resilient and sharp, was now teetering on the edge of truths too heavy for anyone to bear easily. My ex-husband shifted beside me, the ghost of guilt flickering across his features as he tried to reconcile with the man standing before us. The person whose presence disrupted years of constructed reality, whose very existence threatened to unravel all the lies and omissions that had allowed us to survive, if not fully thrive, in the shadows of history. The turning point emerged subtly, not in words alone, but in the weight of acknowledgement, in the flicker of recognition between my daughter and the newcomer, in the way her body seemed to vibrate with a mixture of awe, fear, and anger. And I realized that the letter she had clutched, the document that had seemed so simple and straightforward, was only a portal into a labyrinth of truths, half-truths, and dangerous omissions that no single explanation could satisfy. The congregation held its collective breath as if aware that the invisible tension had reached a critical point, every whisper suspended, every movement scrutinized, and I felt the gnawing pressure of anticipation pressing down on my shoulders, the knowledge that what happened next would irrevocably define our lives, that the path to understanding, reconciliation, or ruin lay in the delicate balance of the words about to be spoken, and in my hands I felt the trembling echo of every sacrifice, every lie, every sleepless night that had brought us to this moment. My daughter's fingers shook as she gripped the letter tighter, the paper crumpling slightly under the force of her anxiety, and I felt a surge of helplessness and fury because the truths she was about to uncover were mine to manage, mine to protect. And yet they were slipping away from my control, cascading into a reality I could only observe, powerless to halt. The newcomer's voice finally cut through the thick silence, measured, calm, deliberate, delivering not just words but revelations that carried the weight of decades, outlining a narrative that entwined absence, secrecy, and manipulation with such precision that it forced us all to reckon with the layers of deception we had absorbed unknowingly, while simultaneously shifting the perspective of those who had gathered here turning allies into skeptics, witnesses into judges, and my daughter into a young woman confronting the full gravity of the world she had inherited. The tension reached its apex as he recounted events I had prayed to remain hidden, detailing motivations, choices, and sacrifices in a way that revealed the invisible threads tying our lives together, exposing not only past betrayals but also the complex web of loyalty, love, fear, and survival that had governed every decision I had made, every secret I had kept, and every risk I had taken to protect the child in my arms from horrors she had yet to comprehend fully. My daughter's face went pale as understanding began to dawn, the weight of generational secrets and hidden alliances settling onto her young shoulders with a gravity that made my heart ache and my hands ache with the desire to shield her. And yet I knew that she could no longer be shielded, that her awareness had grown beyond what silence could contain, that her mind and spirit were now active participants in a story that had long been written but never meant to be fully revealed. The room's attention was drawn entirely to the front, the guests frozen in various states of fascination, horror, and disbelief, the minister pausing mid-gesture as if sensing the magnitude of revelation, the groom's expression tightening, the bride's mother clutching pearls in apprehension, all witnesses to a drama more profound than any wedding could hope to contain. All participants in a moment where personal history and collective observation collided violently, and I felt the pulse of it. All, the cumulative force of truth, lies, fear, and longing pressing into me from every angle, reminding me that the stakes were higher than any personal reconciliation could address, that our lives were now a theater of truth and consequence that demanded reckoning, and that the choices I made in the next seconds could alter everything irreversibly. My daughter's gaze flickered between me, my ex-husband, and the newcomer, her mind processing, calculating, absorbing layers of complexity that I could barely keep up with, and I realized that she had passed a threshold from innocence to awareness, from dependence to critical engagement with the reality of our fractured lives, and that no explanation, no apology, no narrative I could craft in that moment would ever restore her to the sheltered child she had been. The final beats of tension coalesced as the newcomer's words promised further revelations, hints of secrets even darker than those already unearthed, and as the last syllables hung in the charged air, I understood with chilling clarity that the coming moments would force all of us, daughter, parents, and witnesses alike, to confront truths we had evaded for decades, that the fragile constructions of trust and protection would be tested to the absolute limit, and that the next choice, the next revelation, the next gesture could either fracture our lives beyond repair or illuminate a path to a new, painful, and honest understanding that none of us could have predicted. And as my daughter's trembling lips parted to question the newest revelation, I realized that the only certainty in this unfolding story was that nothing would ever be the same again. The tension in the church was suffocating, a tangible force pressing down on my chest so heavily that each breath I drew felt like pulling air through a filter of steel. And as my daughter's eyes flitted between me, my ex-husband, and the newcomer who had shattered the fragile balance of our lives, I realized in a way that left me dizzy that nothing about this moment was ordinary, that every heartbeat carried the weight of decades of secrets, betrayals, and the choices made in desperation, and that the fragile illusion of control I had clung to was crumbling like dry earth under relentless rain. Every subtle shift of the newcomer's stance, every quiet inhalation, every flicker of expression was magnified in my awareness, because I knew these were not idle movements, that each gesture carried significance, that each nuance was designed to fracture the carefully constructed reality I had spent years trying to protect for my daughter. And now, standing here with her trembling beside me, I understood the full magnitude of what it meant to confront a past you thought was buried and discover it alive, breathing, and deliberately shaping the present. The setup of the scene was almost cinematic in its cruelty, as if the universe had chosen this precise moment to gather all the threads of pain, silence, and longing into a single tableau, forcing me to reckon with the very truths I had spent a lifetime avoiding. The betrayal of trust, the absence of love when it was most needed, the fragility of family when confronted with unspoken horrors, and the way a single revelation could undo the foundations of everything I thought I understood about safety, loyalty, and survival. I could feel my daughter's pulse against my side, rapid and erratic, her small body trembling, her mind grappling with the revelations that had just been laid bare, and I experienced an acute awareness of the immense responsibility I carried to guide her through this, to protect her from harm even as the walls of deception that had once shielded us were collapsing around us. The rising tension built like a storm approaching a cliff, inevitable, unstoppable, a force of nature that demanded acknowledgement, and I could feel every nerve in my body responding to it, every muscle coiled, every thought racing through decades of memory and emotion, because I knew that the next moments would define whether we survived this convergence of past and present or whether everything we had worked for would be irrevocably lost to chaos and grief. The turning point came subtly in the way my ex-husband's hands twitched, in the slight narrowing of his eyes, in the way his shoulders stiffened as if bracing for impact, in the way my daughter's lips parted in anticipation of the explanation she had been waiting for, and I realized that the balance of power in this room was shifting, not through violence or loud confrontation, but through the quiet authority of revelation, the unavoidable weight of truth, and the emotional gravity that drew us all into a single vortex of fear, curiosity, and the painful exhilaration of understanding. Every thought I had suppressed over the years, every secret I had held to protect my daughter, every lie I had told in an effort to maintain order and shield her from hurt, now collided in my mind with the unfolding reality, and I understood that the survival I had achieved was only temporary, fragile, a thin veneer over the chaos that threatened to erupt the moment she fully grasped the complexity of our past. The congregation remained frozen, a silent audience to a drama they barely comprehended, yet even their subtle shifts and collective intake of breath reinforced the gravity of the scene, because the energy in the room was no longer simply tension, it was awareness, the shared sense that something monumental was happening that would forever alter the relationships and understandings of those present, and I felt that awareness press down on me with physical force, a reminder that human perception is as powerful as action in shaping the trajectory of a story. My daughter's gaze flitted between us repeatedly, a dance of recognition and confusion, a search for explanation, a plea for understanding, and I realized that her mind was mapping connections I had spent years trying to obscure, that she was beginning to understand the full scope of absence, deception, and emotional manipulation, and that the revelations already in motion were only the first layer of a narrative too complex, too painful, and too human to be simplified or ignored. The newcomer continued to speak, slowly, deliberately, and the words, though soft, carried weight like stones dropping into water, sending ripples through the consciousness of everyone present, reshaping perceptions, challenging assumptions, dismantling the facades we had maintained, and I felt the chill of inevitability settle into my bones, knowing that no matter what I did next, the past could no longer remain silent, could no longer be contained, could no longer protect my daughter from the emotional truths she was meant to confront at this critical moment. My own voice caught in my throat as I felt the convergence of fear, guilt, and maternal instinct, all interwoven in a way that made movement, speech, or rational thought nearly impossible. And yet the instinct to protect my daughter surged with equal strength, compelling me to act, to guide, to intervene, and to try to shield her from the full weight of what was being revealed, knowing fully well that the very act of shielding could no longer prevent the inevitable confrontation with reality. The rising tension expanded further, the storm inside me mirrored by the storm in the room, the collective anticipation of every guest, the unspoken recognition of the wedding's collapse, the fragile threads of social expectation unraveling, and I felt the pull of destiny, of consequence, of choices made decades prior now arriving at their appointed time, pressing against my conscience, my emotions, my body, in a tidal force that left me both terrified and alive in equal measure. The turning point became undeniable when my daughter, with the letter still clutched in her trembling hands, looked at me and asked the question I had been praying she would never ask, the question that pierced me like ice and fire combined, the one that demanded honesty in a moment when honesty could be ruinous or redemptive. And I realized in that instant that the next words spoken, the next confession, the next confrontation would define not just the remainder of the wedding day but the trajectory of her life, our lives, and the lives of everyone tied to this complex web of family, absence, and betrayal. Every memory surged. The nights of silence when I whispered apologies I could not voice aloud, the mornings spent feigning normalcy while my heart fractured, the desperate decisions to run, hide, and survive while leaving pieces of myself behind in shadows and half-truths, and the realization that all of that now collided in one tangible living moment that demanded resolution, truth, and exposure. The climax approached like a distant tide cresting over rocks, inevitable and unstoppable, a force of emotional gravity that pulled at my very core, and I understood that when my daughter finally heard the full story, when she finally processed the implications, the trajectory of our lives would shift irrevocably, that nothing would remain as it had been, and that the fragile illusions of protection I had maintained for decades were about to be replaced by the stark, unflinching light of reality, pain, and understanding. As the newcomer paused, letting the silence stretch unbearably long, I felt every nerve in my body alive, every sense heightened, every thought spiraling, knowing with unshakable clarity that this was the precipice before the final revelation, the moment that would determine whether we survived with our bonds intact or whether the weight of truth would fracture us completely. And as my daughter's lips trembled, her breath shallow and rapid, I realized that the next instant would change everything forever, and that the path forward was no longer mine to dictate, but ours to navigate together, trembling, raw, and unflinchingly real. The church felt unbearably small, the walls closing in as though aware of the weight of decades pressing into a single moment, and I realized that everything we had built, every lie, every absence, every painstaking attempt at normalcy, was collapsing around us in a way that could no longer be managed, contained, or softened, because the presence of the newcomer, the letter in my daughter's trembling hands, and the silent awareness of the congregation had created a storm so dense that it left my chest tight and my thoughts spinning, my heartbeat thrumming like a drum in the hollow of my ears, echoing the gravity of the revelations that were poised to reshape our lives irrevocably. My daughter stood beside me, rigid and pale, clutching the letter as though it were a lifeline, and I felt the familiar surge of maternal instinct, the desperate need to protect her from the shock, the betrayal, the fracture of trust, even as I knew that shielding her now was impossible, that the truths we had buried for decades were unspooling in front of her, vivid, raw, and merciless. The 0 to 3 second hook had already taken hold, the room suspended in the quiet hum of anticipation, every eye drawn to the front, every soul held hostage by the unfolding drama, and I felt an acute awareness of the delicate balance between revelation and destruction, between confession and the preservation of innocence, and the way every second now counted in shaping the path forward. The setup, slow and deliberate, drew my attention inward even as my mind catalogued the reactions of the people around us, from the frozen minister to the tight-lipped guests, from the subtle gasp of recognition to the barely perceptible shift of posture as the story of absence, betrayal, and survival began to manifest in their understanding, and I realized that the impact of our personal history was not confined to us alone, but radiated outward, touching everyone who bore witness, forcing them into a position of judgment, empathy, or both. The rising tension wrapped itself around me, every sense sharpened, every nerve alive, because my daughter's gaze flickered between me, my ex-husband, and the newcomer in a way that spoke of emerging comprehension, of silent calculations, and of the dawning realization that the world she thought she knew had been built on unstable foundations, and now she was standing in the center of a revelation so potent that it demanded acknowledgement, confrontation, and an understanding that would take years to fully digest. The turning point arrived subtly in the micro-expressions of recognition, the slight narrowing of the eyes, the brief intake of breath, the tremor of acknowledgement in the body language of everyone involved, and I understood that the moment was no longer ours alone, that the trajectory of our lives had intersected with history, with consequence, with accountability in a way that could not be reversed, and that the emotional stakes had reached a magnitude that made the room feel suspended between reality and revelation. My mind raced through decades of decisions, choices made under duress, sacrifices for survival, lies told to protect, absences endured in hope of safety, and I felt the crushing weight of inevitability, knowing that no matter what explanation I offered, no matter how I tried to frame the past, the impact of the truth would ripple outward, shaping perceptions, altering loyalties, and irrevocably changing the emotional landscape of my daughter's understanding. The congregation remained frozen, a tableau of human reaction, each person processing the silent drama, the visible tension, the undercurrents of pain, betrayal, and survival, and I realized in that moment that the social narrative was as powerful as the personal one, that the eyes of witnesses amplified the gravity of every decision, every word, every gesture, and that our lives had become a theater of truth and consequence, impossible to conceal, impossible to control. The letter in my daughter's hand, trembling yet resolute, contained truths I had long tried to keep hidden, narratives of abandonment and deception, revelations of absence and unspoken alliances, and I felt the acute intensity of fear, pride, and helplessness converge as she raised her eyes to mine, her small but determined frame conveying understanding beyond her years, and I knew with the sharpest clarity that her perception of me, of him, of the life we had lived, was now irrevocably altered. The rising tension approached its zenith as the newcomer spoke again, voice calm, deliberate, authoritative, laying bare not only the actions of the past but the motives, the fears, and the consequences that had guided every choice, and I felt the full force of accountability pressing down, demanding acknowledgement, demanding response, demanding emotional navigation of a truth that could not be ignored. My ex-husband's body language betrayed the internal conflict, his jaw tightening, his shoulders stiffening, eyes flickering with the simultaneous recognition of guilt, shame, and the longing to reclaim a narrative he had forfeited through absence. And I saw the subtle interplay of responsibility and avoidance that had defined his years away from us, now illuminated in stark, unforgiving detail. My daughter, holding the letter with trembling fingers, processed the revelations, her mind threading together pieces I had feared she would never see, the cognitive and emotional impact resonating in every subtle movement, every blink, every exhalation that signaled the complex interplay of fear, understanding, anger, and growing clarity. And I felt the surge of maternal love mixed with helplessness, a powerful emotional cocktail that left me both paralyzed and determined. The tension extended, drawing out the strategic viral structure as every eye tracked her reaction, as the narrative threads of betrayal, absence, survival, and revelation intertwined in real time, forcing an engagement that no one present could escape. And I understood that this moment was as much about shaping perception as it was about revealing truth, that the stakes were both personal and performative, both intimate and witnessed. The turning point solidified when my daughter, with courage born of exposure and instinct, raised the letter, her gaze unwavering, and questioned the narratives that had been delivered, challenging both her father and the newcomer, forcing the confrontation into full clarity, demanding honesty, and leaving no room for evasion, half-truths, or silence. And in that instant, the story reached its most acute point of tension, as the emotional stakes could no longer be moderated, mediated, or postponed. Every memory I had suppressed, every protective measure, every calculated omission surged through me in a wave of raw emotional intensity, and I felt the simultaneous pull of despair and hope, the desperate need to shield her from pain and the recognition that facing the truth was an act of survival, healing, and empowerment, all converging in the same breathless moment of revelation. The congregation absorbed the weight of the moment, their collective awareness amplifying the emotional impact, their silence a testament to the power of witnessed human experience. The unfolding tableau of family, betrayal, and survival stretching across the room and imprinting itself in subtle shifts of body language, the quick inhalation of breath, and the quiet recognition that the human heart is both resilient and fragile, capable of profound understanding and devastating fracture. The rising tension peaked in the seconds before my daughter's next words, when the entire trajectory of our family, our relationships, and the long-hidden truths poised on the cusp of full disclosure, and I felt the raw, unrelenting emotional gravity of the moment pressing on me, on her, on him, on everyone who bore witness, a pressure that was almost physical in its intensity and yet necessary, because only in full exposure could healing, reckoning, and transformation begin. As she spoke, the words were tentative yet firm, trembling with the weight of discovery and the courage of confrontation, and I realized that the path forward would require navigation of unprecedented emotional terrain, where trust must be rebuilt, where absence and betrayal must be reconciled, and where love and survival must coexist with the scars of history. The final seconds stretched like eternity, every micro-expression, every heartbeat, every intake of breath magnified, and I understood that the next moments, though still uncertain, would set the stage for the final reconciliation and resolution, that the fractures could begin to mend only through acknowledgement, honesty, and courage, and that our lives were now irrevocably entwined with truths too heavy to ignore but too essential to deny, leading us inexorably toward the final chapters of this long, tumultuous, and deeply emotional journey. The church felt impossibly quiet, the kind of silence that presses into your chest and makes every breath feel heavy, and I could sense the collective anticipation of everyone present as though the air itself was aware that this was the final moment, the convergence of all truths long hidden, all betrayals carefully obscured, all absences that had shaped our lives into fragile, jagged fragments, and now demanded acknowledgement, confrontation and resolution. My daughter stood beside me, her small hand in mine, trembling yet steady in its grip, and I felt the bittersweet weight of maternal pride and fear, knowing that she had absorbed more in these past minutes than many adults ever do in a lifetime, that she had seen the raw edges of deception and betrayal and was now poised at the precipice of understanding, ready to face what the past had forced us to endure. The 0 to 3 second hook had already delivered its full force hours ago, but the tension lingered, as though every soul in the room remained suspended in the same state of dread, awe, and expectation, waiting for the final unveiling that would bind or fracture us permanently. The setup, slow and deliberate, unfolded internally for me, each thought, memory, and emotional shard flowing into one another as I processed decades of absence, silence, and half-truths, realizing that the emotional landscape of our family had been mapped by the gaps between presence and betrayal, by the choices made in desperation, and by the survival instincts that had defined each of us in different ways. The rising tension coursed through my body like electricity, my nerves alive with anticipation, my mind tracing every path we had walked to arrive here, and my heart ached with the recognition that this confrontation was more than mere revelation. It was a reckoning, a chance to confront the ghosts of our past and to define at last who we were, who we could be, and whether we could survive the truths that had long been hidden. My ex-husband stood beside me, rigid and taut, every line of his body betraying a mixture of fear, guilt, and anticipation, and I could see that the years of absence, the choices he had made, the moments he had forfeited, had culminated in this single point where acknowledgement was unavoidable, where redemption was possible only if the weight of truth was met with humility and accountability, and where the emotional stakes were higher than any ceremonial expectation, social norm, or public gaze. My daughter's wide eyes flickered with comprehension, anger, and reluctant awe, as she processed not only the absence of her father but the broader truths of love, betrayal, and survival that had shaped our family, and I felt the raw intensity of her awareness press into me, a reminder that the protective measures I had taken were no longer sufficient, that shielding her from reality had been necessary but ultimately temporary, and that now the only path forward was honesty, courage, and emotional navigation of the truths she now held in her young but perceptive hands. The turning point crystallized in the collective gaze of all present as the newcomer, whose presence had catalyzed the unraveling of decades of silence, met our eyes with quiet authority, signaling the beginning of reconciliation, explanation, and perhaps even redemption, and I felt the charged air press against my skin, reminding me that the human heart, though fragile, has an astonishing capacity for resilience, understanding, and renewal when faced with the full weight of lived experience. Memories surged unbidden, nights of sleepless worry, whispered prayers in darkness, tears shed silently over fractured promises, the long stretches of absence that had defined my daughter's formative years, and the desperate, often lonely attempts to create a semblance of normalcy while keeping her safe. And I realized that all these threads, all these choices, had led inexorably to this final confrontation where the past could no longer remain silent, where love, truth, and forgiveness would either coexist or shatter entirely. My daughter's voice trembled as she asked the first of many questions, probing the absence, seeking the truth behind the silences, and I felt the tremor of recognition in my own chest, that these were not just questions but keys, unlocking narratives I had long tried to contain, exposing the human complexity of survival, loyalty, and betrayal that had shaped our lives in ways both subtle and profound. The rising tension reached its emotional apex as explanations flowed, narratives intertwined, and confessions emerged in waves, each revealing motives, fears, and choices, each highlighting the fragility and strength of our connections, and each demanding recognition of the humanity that had guided, limited, and occasionally failed us. I watched my daughter absorb these revelations, her mind weaving together threads of understanding, her heart learning both forgiveness and anger, her body tense with anticipation yet leaning into the truth, and I felt the quiet pride of maternal protection alongside the ache of helplessness, the duality of witnessing growth through confrontation, the bittersweet proof that truth, no matter how painful, can empower. The congregation's collective awareness amplified the emotional stakes, each witness a silent testament to the universality of family struggle, loss, and reconciliation, and I recognized that this moment was not only ours but a shared human experience of confronting the consequences of choices, secrets, and absences. Every memory I had held close surged forward, The late-night vigils, the quiet tears, the prayers for strength and safety, the whispered guidance meant to protect my daughter, all converging with the present revelations in a symphony of human resilience, vulnerability, and enduring love. And I understood with absolute clarity that the path forward demanded courage, emotional honesty, and unwavering commitment to rebuild trust. The newcomer's calm, deliberate voice continued to illuminate hidden truths, and I watched the subtle changes in my ex-husband's posture, in the tension of his jaw, in the fleeting flicker of guilt and recognition that revealed both remorse and hope. And I realized that reconciliation, though tenuous, was possible, that understanding, though hard one, could emerge, and that survival, emotional, relational, and spiritual, depended upon our ability to embrace truth fully, without evasion, without denial, and without fear. My daughter, standing at the center of this unfolding narrative, processed everything with astonishing clarity, her questions probing, her comprehension deepening, and her emotional responses, tears, trembling lips, widened eyes, painting a portrait of a young woman grappling with both pain and empowerment. And I understood that the very act of facing the full scope of family history, betrayal, and resilience was teaching her lessons I could not have imparted in words alone. The tension slowly began to ease as acknowledgement, explanation, and tentative forgiveness unfolded, creating a rhythm that allowed for the first breaths of relief in what had been an emotionally suffocating day. Yet I remained acutely aware that the work of healing was only beginning, that the scars of absence, betrayal, and loss could not vanish in a single afternoon, and that our collective journey, daughter, parents, and witnesses, would continue beyond these walls, carried in memory, reflection, and ongoing dialogue. In those final minutes, as words of truth, apology, and acknowledgement exchanged quietly but forcefully, I felt the weight of decades lift slightly, the shadows recede just enough to allow the first light of understanding to touch our lives, and I realized that survival, healing, and relational reconstruction were not acts completed in isolation, but processes nurtured by courage, emotional honesty, and shared confrontation with the truths we had long sought to avoid. My daughter finally lowered the letter, her gaze meeting mine with a depth of comprehension and emotion that left me breathless, and I understood that this was the culmination of everything. Her growth, our reconciliation, the exposure of hidden truths, and the acknowledgement of human fallibility, and that though the path forward would remain challenging, this moment marked the beginning of transformation where love, truth, and resilience could coexist even after decades of pain, betrayal, and absence. And as I finally exhaled, feeling the weight of history slowly shift, I realized that the final arc of our story, though unresolved in its entirety, had begun its journey toward healing, understanding, and reconnection, and that the culmination of revelation, maternal courage, and human resilience would guide us forward, shaping the rest of our lives in ways we were only just beginning to comprehend, leaving me with the quiet certainty that though the past had been painful, the future, though uncertain, was ours to face together with honesty, courage, and love. Please follow me for no reason.